For years, you were probably told the same thing I was, that a good garden is a busy garden, that the secret is more work, more digging, more weeding, more watering, more bags of something from the store. But the folks who fed whole families right through the Depression knew a quieter truth. The best gardeners were never the busiest ones. They were the ones who learned to step back and let the ground do the heavy lifting. Today, I want to hand you 18 vegetables that do exactly that. Crops so forgiving, so willing, that they very nearly grow themselves. Miss a watering, and they wait for you. Skip a weekend, and they keep right on going. But here is the part almost no one tells you. It isn't really the plants that make a garden easy. It's one thing happening underneath all of them, something you cannot buy in a bag, and that is exactly why it was so quietly forgotten. Stay with me, because the 18th crop on this list is the one that finally taught me why. It can feed you every spring for 20 years, from a single afternoon of planting. So let's start with that one thing, because it changes everything that comes after. For generations, we were taught to turn the soil every spring. Dig it, till it, flip it over, break it all up. It feels like real work, and real work feels like good gardening. But here is what the digging actually does. Every time we turn the soil, we tear apart the tiny channels the earthworms spent all year building. We break up the fine threads of fungus that reach out from the roots and carry water back to the plant. And we drag a whole new batch of buried weed seeds up to the light, where they do exactly what seeds do. They sprout. In other words, a good deal of the weeding and watering we do all summer, we created ourselves, back in spring, with the shovel. There was a gardener named Ruth Stout who figured this out long before it was fashionable. Born back in 1884, out in Kansas, she gardened well into her 90s up in Connecticut. The neighbors called her the mulch queen. For years she waited on a man to come plow her field every spring, and one year, when he was late again, she looked at her asparagus coming up all on its own and thought, well, why am I plowing at all? So she stopped. Instead, she kept a thick blanket of hay and leaves and old plant trimmings over her soil, all year round. She never dug. She barely watered. And she grew enough to feed herself and a steady stream of curious visitors, year after year. She wrote it all down for Organic Gardening magazine, and a good many of you may remember reading her. A modern voice tells the very same story, with the science behind it. Dr. Linda Chalker Scott, the extension urban horticulturist at Washington State University, the one who has built a whole career separating garden myth from garden fact, puts it plainly. Laying organic matter on top of the soil and letting it break down right where it lies is simply the most natural way there is to feed the ground beneath your feet. And here is why that matters for a busy gardener. A soil that is covered and alive does 3 of your chores for you. The blanket on top holds moisture like a sponge, so you water less. It blocks the sunlight that weed seeds need, so you weed less. And as it slowly rots down, it feeds the soil life that feeds your plants, so you fertilize less. That's the whole secret. You are not really growing vegetables. You are growing soil. And good soil grows the vegetables for you. So as we go through these 18 crops, keep that in the back of your mind. Every single one of them gets easier, sometimes almost effortless, the moment it's sitting in living covered ground. Before we dig in, and I mean that only figuratively now, do me one small favor. Tell me your growing zone, or even just your state, down in the comments. I read them, and it genuinely changes which of these 18 will be effortless for you, and which will need a little timing. A radish in Georgia and a radish in Minnesota are living 2 very different lives. So drop it below, and let's find your easiest crops together. Let's begin with the crops that forgive you, the ones that hand you a win fast, the ones that rebuild your faith in your own 2 hands. If your patience has worn a little thin over the years, and whose hasn't, start here. A radish goes from a seed in the ground to a crisp root on your plate in as little as 25 to 30 days. There is almost nothing else in the garden that fast. But here is the trick the old-timers use that most folks never learned. Radishes are wonderful company for slow seeds. Sow them right in the same row as your carrots, which can take 2 or 3 lazy weeks just to show themselves. The radishes pop up in days and mark the row, so you don't lose it. And as you pull each radish to eat, you loosen the soil and open a little room for the carrots coming along behind. One crop, quietly doing the bookkeeping for another. The one thing to remember is that a radish is a cool weather soul. Push it into the heat of high summer and it will turn sharp, woody, and bitter, and bolt straight to seed. So keep radishes to the cool shoulders of the year. Early spring, and again in the fall. Get the timing right, and they ask almost nothing of you. Now, if there is one plant famous for sheer generosity, it's zucchini. The old joke is that in zucchini season, you lock your car doors at church, or you'll come back to find someone left a grocery bag of it on your seat. One healthy plant can give you 20, 30, even 40 squash in a single summer. But here is the curious part. The thing that makes it so productive is something you control. A zucchini doesn't grow fruit to feed you, it grows fruit to make seed. So the moment you let one squash sit on the vine and swell into a giant, the plant decides its job is done for the year, and it slows right down. But pick them small and tender, around 6 to 8 inches, and the plant believes it has failed, and tries again and again. The more you harvest, the harder it works. Your laziness is the only thing that can stop it. Two simple things. Give each plant room, about 2 to 3 feet to itself, because crowding is what invites trouble. And when you water, water low, right at the base. Wet leaves in the evening are how you get that dusty white powdery mildew. Keep the leaves dry, keep your hands picking, and zucchini will outgive any gardener alive. Most of us have a soft spot for a big, beautiful slicing tomato. But let's be honest with each other, those big ones can be divas. They crack, they split, they catch every blight that drifts by. Cherry tomatoes are a different animal entirely, and there's a real reason why. When you water a big tomato unevenly, dry for days, then a heavy soak, the plant suddenly floods that huge fruit with water faster than the skin can stretch, and the skin splits. A cherry tomato holds only a small mouthful, so the water moves in gently and evenly, and the skin keeps right up. That little size is exactly what lets it shrug off the very mistakes, the missed waterings, the heat, the forgotten weekends, that ruin the big ones. One plant will hand you hundreds of sweet tomatoes from summer, right up to your first frost. Just give it something to lean on, a cage or a sturdy stake. And here is the one discipline that pays off for years. Don't plant your tomatoes in the very same spot 2 seasons running. The University of Florida's extension folks will tell you that's how soil troubles and tiny root pests quietly build up underground. Move them a few feet each year, and you sidestep the whole problem before it ever starts. Here is one that turns a problem into a gift. Most folks think lettuce belongs in a cool grocery case, fussy and hard to grow. But loose leaf lettuce, the kind where you snip the outer leaves instead of waiting on a tight head, is about as easy as greens get. And it has a secret most gardeners never figure out. Lettuce actually likes a little shade. That shady corner you've written off, the spot behind the tomatoes, the bed that only catches 4 to 6 hours of sun, that is not a bad spot for lettuce. That is the best spot you have. The shade keeps it sweet and slow to bolt, while everything else is begging for full sun. You're growing food in the very space you thought was wasted. One small thing trips people up. So let me save you the trouble. Lettuce seed needs light to wake up and sprout. So when you sow it, press it gently onto moist soil. Do not bury it. Cover it deep and it will sit there in the dark forever, waiting for a sunrise that never comes. Barely cover it, and it comes up like a charm. And to round out our forgiving 5, green onions. This might be the closest thing to free food there is. The next time you buy a bunch at the store and chop off the white root ends, don't throw them out. Stand them root down in a little water, or tuck them into a pot of soil, and within a matter of days you'll see fresh green shoots reaching up. That's the whole magic of them. The root end keeps a little reserve of energy, so every time you snip the green tops for your eggs or your soup, it simply grows them back. Again and again and again. They take up almost no room. A single pot on the porch railing will keep a kitchen supplied for months. They don't mind a bit of shade, and they very nearly refuse to die. For a gardener short on time and space, that is the dream. A plant you start from a scrap you were about to compost, that asks for a windowsill and a little water, and quietly feeds you all season long. So those are the crops that forgive your mistakes. Now let me show you the ones that go a step further. The plants that, from a single sowing, just keep feeding you for months on end. You harvest them, and they grow it right back. If your vegetables had personalities, Swiss chard would be the easygoing old friend who never complains and never leaves. When summer heat makes lettuce give up and bolt, chard keeps right on going. A touch of frost? It stands there unbothered. Here is why it lasts where other greens fail. Chard is a biennial. It lives for 2 years, not one. So it has no urge to rush to flower and die in its very first hot summer, the way lettuce and spinach do. That patience is what carries it clear across the season. And you harvest it the smart way. Snip the outer, older leaves and leave the little growing point in the center alone. The plant just keeps pushing out fresh leaves from the middle, for months. One planting, harvest after harvest. The only thing to watch is rotation. Chard can play host to tiny root pests over time, so don't grow it in the exact same patch every single year. Give it a fresh corner each season, and it will reward you for the whole long haul. Few plants are as stubbornly tough as kale. A cold snap rolls in, and kale keeps growing. And here is the lovely surprise. A light frost doesn't hurt it. It makes it taste better. There's real science under that. When the cold arrives, the kale plant pumps sugar into its own leaves, almost like a natural antifreeze to protect its cells. And we get to taste that sugar. So the very frost that wilts everything else is exactly what turns kale sweet and mild. Many of you have noticed your fall greens tasting better than your summer ones. Now you know why. Like chard, kale is a cut-and-come-again crop. Take the lower outer leaves, leave the center to keep growing, and one plant feeds you for months. The pests that bother it, those little cabbage worms and aphids, don't need a harsh chemical answer. Plant a few aromatic herbs nearby to confuse them, look your leaves over now and then, and pick off what you find by hand. You protect the good bugs in your garden, and you keep your greens clean. Now, bush beans earn their place twice over. First, they're simple. No tall poles or trellises to build the way pole beans need. You plant them in warm soil, water them while they settle in, and then you mostly leave them be. Many give you a harvest in just 50 to 60 days. But beans do something underground that's worth understanding and worth being honest about. Beans are legumes. They strike up a partnership with helpful bacteria on their roots, and together they pull nitrogen, the nutrient that grows green leafy growth, right out of the thin air and into a form the plant can use. So a bean plant largely feeds itself. It barely needs you to fertilize it at all. Now, you will hear it said that beans fertilize your whole garden as they grow. The honest truth is gentler than that. Most of that nitrogen goes to feed the bean itself. The real gift to your soil comes at the end of the season, when you cut the plant off at the ground and leave the roots in place to break down. That's when the soil collects its share. It's a small thing, but it's the honest thing, and it's how you actually build that living ground we talked about. One warning that surprises people: don't overfeed beans with nitrogen fertilizer. Give a bean too much, and it throws all its energy into lush green leaves and forgets to make beans at all. With this one, less really is more. Sugar snap peas are cousins to the bean, another legume that makes much of its own food. But their gift is all about timing, and it's a gift for the gardener who likes to get an early jump. Here's the thing nobody tells you. Peas will sprout in cold soil. Soil so cool that nothing else will even consider germinating. So while the rest of the garden is still fast asleep, you can already have peas up and climbing. Give them a simple string or a bit of wire to grab, keep the soil damp, and they handle the rest. You're harvesting sweet, crisp pods before most folks have even planted. The one rule is that peas despise the heat. The moment real summer arrives, the vines tire out and stop. So plant them early, while there's still a chill in the morning air, or again in late summer for a fall picking. Work with their love of the cool, and they ask almost nothing in return. Let's pause right here, about halfway through, and talk about water. Because for many of us, hauling cans and dragging hoses around the yard is the chore that's only gotten harder with the years. So here's the secret, and it runs against instinct. Watering a little bit every day is just about the worst thing you can do. A light daily sprinkle only wets the top inch of soil, so your plants keep all their roots up high, near the surface, where the sun dries them out fast, and they grow needy and weak. Instead, water deeply and seldom. A good long soak once or twice a week sends the water down deep, and the roots chase it down after. They grow long and strong and reach for the moisture far below, where the heat can't touch it. You end up with tougher plants that can go days without you, and you spend far less of your own time standing there with a hose. And if you want to make it nearly hands-off, a simple drip line on a timer is worth every penny. The master gardeners at the University of California note that drip watering runs better than 90% efficient. The water goes straight to the roots, instead of drifting off on the breeze or evaporating off the leaves the way an overhead sprinkler does. Set the timer, and you can sit in the shade with your coffee while the garden waters itself. Most gardeners who switch find they're using anywhere from a third to two-thirds less water than the old sprinkler ever did. Deep and seldom, with a little help from a timer. That alone takes the hardest chore in the garden and very nearly erases it. All right, with that settled, let me introduce you to a group of plants that take low maintenance to an almost stubborn extreme. These are the crops that don't just tolerate a little neglect, they seem to prefer it. Most folks plant sweet potatoes for the roots hidden underground, and then never realize the plant is busy doing their chores up top. While regular potatoes want cool weather, sweet potatoes are tropical at heart. They revel in the sweltering heat of summer, and they shrug off drought and the poor, sandy soil that would starve other crops. But here is the quiet gift. As a sweet potato grows, it throws out long, sprawling vines that blanket the ground. And that blanket is living mulch. It shades the soil so it holds water. It crowds out weeds so they never get a foothold. In other words, the plant does your watering and your weeding for you, just by growing the way it grows. And as a bonus, the leaves are perfectly good eating too, something most people never learn. You don't even start it from seed. You plant little rooted cuttings called slips. The only thing it truly needs is a long, warm season, up to 120 days, so wait until the soil is good and warm before you set it out. Then step back and let it cover the ground for you. If you love a little fire in your cooking, jalapenos, serranos, cayennes, hot peppers may be the most low-drama plant on this whole list. Once they're settled and the nights have warmed up, they just quietly get on with it. And here's the part that delights me, because it turns a gardener's guilt right on its head. Hot peppers actually make better fruit when you treat them a little rough. They want less water than tomatoes. And a touch of water stress, letting them go a bit dry, actually concentrates the heat and the flavor right in the pepper. So the busy gardener's so-called failing, forgetting to water, is the very thing that makes a hotter, tastier pepper. For once, neglect is the recipe. There's just one limit to their love of heat. When it climbs past about 95 degrees and stays there, the plant may drop its blossoms before they can set fruit. So if you live somewhere with brutal summers, tuck your peppers where they'll catch a little dappled afternoon shade. A few hours relief in the worst of the day, and they'll set fruit happily right up to frost. Rosemary is technically an herb, but it earns its spot here, because almost nothing is easier to keep alive, as long as you understand one thing about where it comes from. Rosemary grew up on the dry, rocky, sun-baked hillsides of the Mediterranean. So everything we usually call good care, rich soil, regular watering, a bit of fertilizer, is actually wrong for it. It wants poor soil, blazing sun, and to be left well alone. Miss a watering? Rosemary doesn't even notice. Forget to feed it? It grows on anyway. The fastest way to kill rosemary is to be too kind to it. The one thing it truly cannot abide is what gardeners call wet feet, sitting in heavy, soggy clay. Plant it in waterlogged ground and the roots rot away. So give it a spot that drains well, a slope, a raised bed, a gritty corner, and a single plant will hand you fragrant sprigs for your roasts and your bread for years, asking for next to nothing in return. If you garden somewhere hot, you already know the heartbreak of summer spinach. The minute it turns warm, regular spinach bolts, turns bitter and melts away. Malabar spinach does the exact opposite, and that's the whole trick of it. It isn't really spinach at all. It's a tropical climbing vine that wakes up and races when the heat and the humidity arrive, the very weather that kills the real thing. So while other gardeners are mourning their bolted greens in July, you've got thick, glossy, tender leaves coming faster than you can pick them. Give it a simple trellis to climb, and a single plant will turn into a living wall of summer salad. Just know going in, it grows with real enthusiasm. Give it that vertical support, or it will happily reach over and lean on its neighbors. But for fresh greens, in the dead heat of summer, when nothing else will cooperate, there is hardly anything easier. This one is a bit of an oddball, and a bit of a legend. The Jerusalem artichoke, also called the sunchoke, is a tall, cheerful, sunflower-like plant that produces crisp, nutty tubers underground, a little like a water chestnut. And it does it in poor soil, with no fertilizer and almost no help from you. A single plant can leave you digging up far more tubers than one household can eat. But here's the honest warning that comes with the gift. This plant is a determined spreader. Every little scrap of tuber you leave in the ground will sprout a brand new plant next year. Put it loose in your main vegetable bed, and within a season or two it will quietly try to take over the whole thing. So the wise move is to give it its own dedicated corner, a bed of its own, or a large container, somewhere it can be as enthusiastic as it likes, without crowding everyone else out. Plant it once, in the right place, and you'll have sunchokes for the rest of your gardening life. And one small kindness to your stomach, introduce them slowly, in modest helpings, the first time around. Now, before we get to the last four, and the last one is the real prize, I've gathered everything we've covered onto a single page you can keep. The whole list, the deep and seldom watering trick, the honest year 1 to year 3 of building living soil, a short list of what to skip and what to plant by season. It's all there, on one sheet you can tape inside the shed door or tuck into your garden journal. If you'd like it, point your phone's camera at the code on your screen, and it's yours. No charge, nothing to sign up for. Just a small thank you for spending this time with me. And then stay right here, because the 4 crops still coming are the true plant at once, harvest for years champions. And the very last one is the crop that started this whole story for me. So here we are, the long game crops. The ones that ask for a little patience up front, and then pay you back season after season, for years, while you do almost nothing at all. This is low-maintenance gardening at its very finest. Garlic might be the ultimate plant-it-and-forget-it crop, and the reason is all in the timing. You plant it in the fall, break a head into individual cloves, push each one a couple of inches into the soil, pointy end up, and then cover the whole bed with a cozy blanket of mulch. And here's the beautiful part. Garlic does its work in the off-season, while you're indoors by the fire and the garden is asleep. It quietly sets roots through the cold, waits out the winter under its mulch, and wakes up to swell into full bulbs the following summer. You did the planting on one autumn afternoon, and the calendar did all the rest. 2 quick tips. Buy seed garlic from a nursery rather than planting bulbs from the grocery store, because those are often treated to keep them from sprouting. And keep that mulch thick, because the one thing garlic won't tolerate is fighting weeds for its space. Mulch it well, and it sails right through, untroubled. Potatoes feel like buried treasure to harvest, and here's the wonderful news for anyone whose back has earned a rest. You don't have to dig at all. This is Ruth Stout's old method, the mulch queen herself, and it could not be simpler. You lay your seed potatoes right on top of the soil. You don't bury them. You just cover them over with a thick blanket of clean straw, maybe 6 to 8 inches deep. As the green shoots push up, you tuck more straw around them. And when harvest time comes, there's no shovel, no aching back, no digging. You simply pull back the straw with your hands, and there they are. Clean potatoes, resting right on top of the ground, like eggs in a nest. There is one rule here that matters for your safety, so listen close. Any potato that pokes up and catches the sunlight will turn green. And green potatoes develop a substance that isn't good to eat. So keep your growing potatoes always covered, with straw or with soil. If you do see green, simply set those ones aside. Keep them in the dark, and you'll be pulling back that straw like a treasure hunter for years to come. Rhubarb is one of those old-fashioned perennials that gives back far more than it ever asks. Those tart, ruby-red stalks make the pies and jams our mothers and grandmothers swore by. And once you settle it into a sunny, well-drained spot, a single rhubarb plant will feed you every spring for 10, 15, even 20 years. It actually needs a cold winter to do well. The chill is what resets it to send up fresh stalks each spring. When you harvest, don't cut the stalks. Take hold near the base and give a gentle twist and pull, and they come away clean. Dr. Linda Chalker Scott, that same Washington State horticulturist, even keeps a university guide on growing it well. But here is the one thing every rhubarb grower simply must know, and it matters. Only the stalks are safe to eat. The big, handsome leaves are not. They hold a natural acid in concentrations strong enough to make you sick, so they should never be eaten. Just cut them off and toss them on the compost pile, where they do no harm at all. Respect that one line, and rhubarb will reward you for decades. And so we come to number 18, the one I promised you at the very start. If a single crop could stand for everything we've talked about today, it's asparagus. Think about this. Almost every vegetable asks you to start over every single year. Buy seed, prepare a bed, plant again. Asparagus does not. You plant it once. And once that bed is established, it sends up tender spears every single spring for 15-20 years, sometimes longer. A single afternoon of planting, paying you back for the better part of 2 decades. Now it does ask one thing of you, and it asks it up front. Patience. For the first 2 or 3 years, you must resist picking those early spears and let the plant pour its energy down into building a deep, powerful root system instead. And after the spring harvest each year, you let the leftover spears grow up into tall, feathery ferns. Never cut them down while they're green, because those ferns spend all summer gathering sunlight to recharge the crown underground for next year's crop. Let them stand until they yellow and die back on their own in winter. That little bit of patience is the whole bargain. A bit of faith at the beginning, and then 20 springs of asparagus for almost no work at all, which, when you think about it, is the truest version of everything on this list. The best gardens were never the busiest ones. So let's gather it all up, simply. 18 crops, but really, 3 ideas. First, choose plants that forgive you. The radishes and zucchini and cherry tomatoes that bounce back from a missed weekend. Second, choose plants that repeat for you. The chard and kale and green onions you cut, and they grow right back. And the garlic and rhubarb and asparagus you plant once and harvest for years. And third, underneath all of it, feed the soil, not the plant. Keep the ground covered and alive. Water deep and seldom, and let that living soil do your watering, your weeding, and your feeding for you. That's the quiet math of it. The less you fight your garden, the more it gives. The busiest gardener is rarely the one with the fullest basket. I told you, at the very start, that the 18th crop taught me why all of this is true. So let me tell you how. Years ago, I inherited an old garden, overgrown, half-forgotten, the soil not turned in ages. I spent that first spring doing everything the catalogs told me to, feeding the plants, fussing over them, working myself sore. And in the middle of all that weedy neglect, in a corner I hadn't touched at all, the asparagus came up anyway. Strong, faithful, asking nothing of me. It took me a long, humbling while to understand what it was telling me, that I'd had it backwards all along. The garden was never waiting on my hard work. It was waiting on me to stop, to feed the ground and then get out of its way. The very same lesson Ruth Stout learned, looking at her own asparagus, all those years ago. That's the kind of gardening I hope you carry with you. The slow, honest, neighborly kind, where the soil does the heavy lifting and we just get to keep showing up for the harvest. If that is the kind of gardening you come from, or the kind you'd like to grow into, then you already belong here. Subscribe, and let's keep tending the old, honest way, together. I'll be right here, by the garden bed, when you get back.